on the effect of dung derived from different pasture types on temperate dung beetles. Is this gonna? Yeah, there we go. So before I begin, there are three distinct functional groups of dung beetles. Globally, there is a fourth, which is actually a parasitoid. However, we won't encounter those. So the first functional group are the dwellers. These are the dung beetles that live and dwell within the dung pad itself. So they use the pad for the reproduction, whether it's through laying an egg into a cavity or sculpting a space for their own little brood balls. The second functional group are the tunnelers. These are the ones that dig beneath the dung pad and sculpt out spaces for their brood balls as well. And the third are your typical National Geographic dung beetles, where you see them carving the ball out of the dung pad and rolling it away to be placed either at the base of grass or to be buried. However, they all have a very similar life cycle. There's an egg which is placed into a brood. So for the tunnelers and the rollers, these are the ones that they've sculpted themselves. And the egg then hatches, the larvae feeds on the brood, so it is limited to that brood, and then eventually pupates, and then a new adult emerges and the life cycle keeps going. So there is actually a bit of information on the fact that the dung quality influences the reproduction of beetles. So it's influenced by the animal source, so whether it's a sheep or a cow, or even a monkey and a donkey. The other influences are seasonal, so summer versus winter. Might not be huge variation in some areas, but in other areas, the variation is significant. But then also the question of feed source comes in, where you've got, there's been research done where irrigated pastures have been compared to dryland pastures. And then there's also been research on how grain feeding compares to, say, pasture feeding. However, in Australia, we have a huge number of pasture species. There's no one distinct pasture species that's common throughout our very vast continent. And I've aimed to try to tap into this a little bit. So my questions are around how dung derived from cattle feeding on different pasture types influences the field abundance and species richness, which will be my question one, but also how it influences the brood production of two tunnels, which will be my second question. But before I can delve into that, I need to explain the dungs in question. So I've got a rye clover pasture, I've got a forage oat pasture, and I have an improved native pasture. So they're different herds of cattle. They've been on this pasture for a long period of time, and they haven't been drenched for at least 6 weeks when I collected them. But they all have different characteristics. So for moisture content of these dungs, the forage oat had a higher moisture content than the improved and the rye clover. The improved and rye clover were both sitting around the 86% moisture content, whereas oat was just below 90%. Then for total carbon, the improved has around 43% total carbon within the dung, whereas rye clover is sitting around that 40 mark, and then the oat is sitting around 37%. And for total nitrogen, not really surprising, it's the rye clover because of the leguminous crop that has a 3% nitrogen content, while the other two are both sitting just around that 2.6% total nitrogen. And again, the pH of the dungs, we've got the improved, which is slightly alkaline, the rye clover, which is nearly smack bang neutral, and the oat, which is slightly acidic. And then finally, for the energy content, The improved is sitting just above 18 megajoules per kilogram of cow dung, whereas rye clover is sitting around 17 and oat is below 16 megajoules. So just as a quick overview, the moisture content was higher in oat while improved and rye clover were fairly similar. The pH was, the improved was slightly alkaline, rye clover was neutral, and the oat was acidic. Total carbon was improved. The improved pasture was higher than the rye clover, which in turn was higher than the oat. The total nitrogen, we saw that rye clover was higher than the improved versus improved and the oat. And finally, for the energy content, we have the improved higher than rye clover and higher than oat. Right, on to the good stuff. So question one, how does dung derived from cattle feeding on different pasture types influence field abundance and species richness? So this is beautiful Armidale in the bottom right-hand corner of the field. And these are my paddocks. So I've taken two farms, adjoining farms, and they were spaced over 5 kilometers, to which I added 5 transects. These transects had to be at least 500 meters apart, and these were sampled monthly. At each transect, though, there were 3 points, each spaced 100 meters apart from the other. And each point was randomized for the 3 pasture types as to what go where. And this was randomized again every single month. So to actually measure the abundance and species richness, I took a pot filled with sand and I buried this into the ground so that it was level with the surrounding soil, to which a 1 kilogram dung pat was added on top. Now, the reason I haven't gone with traditional pitfall traps is because I'm also measuring burial, but I will not be presenting that in this presentation. So after 24 hours, the dung pad and the pot are returned to the lab for processing. So what have I seen so far? So I'm 6 months into this field experiment. I don't know about everyone else, but I'm wishing it would stop raining up here. And unfortunately, because of the COVID outbreak, I wasn't able to sample in August. So please be aware of that in the following graphs. So average abundance, July, middle of winter up here, sitting around 10 degrees, no activity. Finally, in September, we start to get a little bit of beetle activity. Then in October, we start to see the differences. So the pattern that I observed in October is highlighted again in November. However, it was to a smaller degree. We saw that the rye clover in orange had more beetles per pot and dung pat than improved, but the improved was higher than the oat. So you might be wondering what species are the most abundant up here. So far, Aphodius fimentarius has been 63% of all samples. We're talking nearly 600 fimentarius per pot. That's how many we've got so far. And then Aphodius lividus, both of which are dwellers. Onthophagus binotus as well is the dominant tunneler up here, and especially early season. Other species I've encountered are the Uniticellus africanus and fulvus, both of which have been introduced, and the 2 natives, Onthophagus granulatus and australis. Now, for average species richness, again, August, I couldn't actually sample because of the COVID outbreak up here, but early season, very hard to actually get even 1 or 2 species into the pots. But then again, in September, it starts building up. And we get this very interesting pattern where the different pasture types are actually sort of jumping ahead of each other. We're seeing oat with more species in September, then improved in October, and then the rye clover only just in November. All in all, though, we've had 10 species across the 3 different pasture types, with rye clover having all 10 species. The species do include the predatory hister, and then the improved pasture had 9 species and oat only had 8. There were a lot of singletons, I must admit as well. So for question 1 conclusion, the field abundance we're seeing different patterns emerging for the different pasture types, with forage oat appearing to be not as, like, the number of beetles not being as abundant in oat pasture. Sorry, oat pasture derived. And for field richness, oat has fewer species in total compared to the rye clover and improved. So now I'll be talking about my second question, which is how these different dungs actually influence the brood production of the two tunnelers. So I've taken two tunneling species, Uniticellus intermedius and Orthophagus binotus. And then in a glass house, which was temperature controlled at 25 degrees centigrade during the day and 20 degrees at night, the beetles were given a 1-week acclimation period. So the setup for this was they were in a 3-litre container, 2/3 filled with sand and vermiculite, as a 50-50 mix, which was moistened to 10%.
Just a 12-minute warning.
Okay, thanks. So these beetles were fed twice a week, 150 grams for Uniticellus and 200 grams for binotus. The only reason for that was the binotus actually consumed 150 grams very easily in the preliminary trials. And then once again, they were fed twice a week. Containers emptied and reset, and broods were allocated. Now, this is the only graph I will present for this question. And it's the average number of broods per pot per week, and Uniticellus, based on the median, produces more broods in oat compared to rye, and then improved was the lowest. However, as you can see, it was quite variable, and binotus had the opposite, where improved and rye clover were very similar and fewer broods were in oat. So again, pasture type does matter when it comes to the field work we do. And it appears that it does matter as well when it comes to brood production. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. That's great. We have time for a question or two. You can start in the chat room or just talk out loud.
I feel like that's pretty comprehensive.
Yes. So I have a few questions, Tom. My first one is about gut microbes. Are you thinking about looking at the diversity of gastrointestinal microbes from the cattle, and do they vary with the forage?
I would absolutely love to. Unfortunately, that's outside of the scope of my project at the moment.
Yeah.
I think there has been some work done on that, and they have found some differences. But I think it was 1 or 2 studies done in the US.
Okay, and just very quickly, since we've only got less than a minute, do you think the high moisture quantity in oat might be more attractive to early emergent adults because they're trying to get a lot of liquid food to build up their own resources, and then they might switch as they need to breed?
It's very possible, yeah. And potentially that's what we're seeing with the species observed in the oat in the field, where we're getting more early in the season. So it could be capturing something like that, yes.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Tom. I'm sorry, I forgot to turn my video back on there.
No, that's all good.
And we move on to our second talk.